Well, good evening. Is anyone still out there? Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sticking with us. I like to say that this is the last talk of the night. I like to say that I'm going to really dazzle you, but I hope you can maybe settle for just mild entertainment. I'd like to start off talking to you tonight with a question. How do we make the transition from war to peace? Or stated another way, how do we make the transition from a state of violence to a condition of nonviolence?
Forgiving.
I'm going to answer that question, actually, with the thanks for that, with a story. I'm going to tell you a story about a group of men and women who took up arms to fight for a cause in which they strongly believed. It's a story of a group of Guatemalan ex-combatants. But before I get into that story, I want to back up a little and maybe explore with you maybe the bigger question, what is peace? I want to draw your attention to this, but first actually, if the media is any indication, and when I speak of the media, it's like reading the newspaper, watching TV, if the media really kind of gives us what we want or delivers us what we want to see, I think we all would agree that it's like we really have this love affair with war, and that we're not really that interested so much in peace. Look at what happened in countries in the Middle East. Tunisia, for example. Remember just a few months ago, I was in the news every day, and then there was a ceasefire, and then we forgot about it, and reporters moved on to the next country and the next country. Currently, Libya, Syria are the big topics, right? But you can, probably you can imagine that once the ceasefires are reached there as well, it's going to be pretty quiet, and we're not going to hear a lot about that. But it is actually at this moment, when a ceasefire happens, that's where a society or a community moves through the crucible to nonviolence. And it's that journey that I think is the most exciting and I'd like to talk to you about tonight. But I want to first draw your attention to this. On top, you see the words war and peace. And sometimes we can look at war and peace as kind of like a dichotomy. It's like we're either in a state of war or peace, and there's kind of nothing in between. The minute people lay down their weapons, we're in peace. However, I'd like to draw your attention to the line on the bottom, which is probably more accurate, where the distinction between war and peace is probably like a continuum. And at any given time, we might fall in some place on that. So what we start off with when the weapons are laid down is what we may call negative peace. So what is negative peace? It is simply a state when no one's shooting and killing each other. But what are we really trying to aim when we want to end war and seek peace? Let's call that positive peace. Positive peace is a state where, in fact, all members of a society or community enjoy in the social and economic equality, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression. That is more what positive peace is. Laying down weapons brings about negative peace, but it is this journey to positive peace that we are interested in. So let me start my story. Again, how does one make the transition from war to peace? Let me first just give you a little bit background about the war. This is a map of Guatemala, and it's closer than you think. There's only 2 countries that separate Canada from Guatemala. So really, Guatemala is truly our neighbor. The Civil War ended in 1996, and the 36 Civil War was actually the longest and bloodiest civil war in the history of the Western Hemisphere. 200,000 people were killed in what was officially labeled a genocide by the United Nations. But I'd like to tell you about what happened after 1996, when the guerrillas and the government forces got together after years of negotiation and laid down their weapons and signed peace accords. What happens with ex-combatants at that point? It's a process that actually is now being incorporated throughout the world, and often it's UN-type organizations that facilitate this. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, called DDR for short. Disarmament is pretty straightforward. Guerrillas simply hand over their weapons to such as a UN official, kind of form a line, hand it in. That's pretty straightforward. Demobilization is a little bit more complex. Basically, it's a strategy, usually organized by outside forces, where rebel forces are separated, disbanded, and the thought is that when rebel forces stay together, is they continue to pose a threat to peace. So we have to separate and divide people. Reintegration, that's probably the most complex. As you can imagine, if you're a rebel and you spend perhaps most of your adult life, if not all of it, with a gun on your side and fighting for a cause, to all of a sudden have a state of negative peace is quite alarming, you could say. And so what reintegration usually does is it's programs set up to reintegrate someone back into society. Job training, for example, learn computers, learn how to be a construction worker or carpenter, for example. That all sounds great. The problem is Guatemala, like so many other countries in the world where these civil wars take place, is the economies are in ruin. So although it sounds good, this training actually doesn't help so many of the people who have nothing to go back to. So again, just revisiting, when you enter that crucible on your journey towards nonviolence, what do you take with you and what do you leave behind? Perhaps the question of what you leave behind is simple. For these Guatemalan rebels, it was their weapons, for one thing, and a life of violence, essentially. But I found, what was really more interesting was the question of what do you take with you? This is where I come in, but let me first explain. The number of Guatemalan rebels was actually pretty small, about 3,500 in total at the end of the Civil War. Of those 3,500, the majority of them had a life to return to, namely a family, perhaps a job, or some kind of existence that didn't make it too hard to reintegrate. There was a significant minority of people who had nothing to return to, because as you remember, there was a genocide, and over 600 villages were completely obliterated. Many of the people from those villages who escaped became rebels, and they had no family left because they had, like their villages, had been burnt to the ground, and men, women, and child had all been killed. So you can imagine what that was like. What a small group of them chose to do is, in the midst of this amazing vulnerability and uncertain future, they chose to form an intentional community, a cooperative, and that community was called Nuevo Horizonte. And now this is where I come in the picture, because probably up till now you're wondering, what does that have to do with me? Well, I had the unique opportunity, along with my family, to actually live in this community a few years ago for 4 months. And while I was there, I was actually a full-time student studying by distance. And in addition to my studies, I had the amazing lived experience of living with a group of people who were in this amazing transition from war to peace. And it was a terrific learning experience for myself. So that's where I came in. I found it so interesting so much that I actually returned a few years later to do some formal interviews, and that ultimately turned into my dissertation. Having pored over the interviews for a lot of time, some themes or strategies jumped out at me. They were themes and strategies that helped these people in their transition from war to peace. The first of the 5 themes that I'm going to quickly talk to you is the theme of being united. Now this is kind of unique because, of course, what I mentioned earlier too is actually the aim of reintegration is to separate rebels and to disperse them. This group realized that what they needed through this crucible was to remain united. The second strategy that jumped out to me when I was looking at their information was being autonomous. Now, the community of Nuevo Horizonte wasn't just a small community. It was actually 9 square kilometers. It was quite large, but it had absolutely no infrastructure. There was absolutely nothing there. They started from zero, like they said. They needed a lot of help, and they put the call out to a lot of people, to the world, in fact. Now, that's interesting because a lot of people actually engaged and wanted to help them. The thing that was interesting, however, the people realized in their collective and united voice is that was a challenge. Because when you allow other people to come in, a lot of, let's say, international NGOs, there's a challenge that they can take over, right? Often with good intentions, they make decisions, they control the budgets, and things like that. This group of ex-combatants realized that in order to make that transition, they needed to remain autonomous. A third thing is being connected. When they returned, they returned to a community where there was all kinds of civilian communities around them. And there was a disconnection because they had a totally different lived experience for the last decade of their lives. And they weren't trusted. A lot of people were suspicious of them. And I remember a woman telling the story when they first tried to sell their eggs in the market, no one would buy their eggs because they were afraid, because they were rebels. I'll just give you one example, there are many, of how they connected with the neighbors around them. The community of Nuevo Horizonte very quickly set up their own water system where they had a tap in every household. This was quite unique among the community because the community surrounding them did not have running water. They took their expertise and gave it to the community surrounding them. And there is no better way than to gain the trust and a rapport with people than to work community to provide some basic services. The fourth one is being visionary. Even though they gave up their armed struggle, they did not lose sight of their ideas that formed the basis of their violent struggle in the first place, namely seeking a country with the tenets of social and economic justice. I'll just, again, just give you one example of how they remained visionary. Within a very short time, this community set up their own schools and their own daycare because they realized that education ensured a future for their children. Finally, the fifth strategy that came out of the interviews was being a role model. They accomplished so much in this short time, the 10, 15 years since they formed this community. They have started a number of agricultural projects. They have an ecotourism projects, a jungle tour, a restaurant and a hostel for international people to learn about their story, not only to come to relax, but to learn about their vision. So I put this together, and I went back and I asked the people who I interviewed this is how I see your going through the crucible, your journey, being united as this foundational theme, strategy that you used, and these other four themes as kind of streaming from that. And they said, yes, that is what helped us. So if you ever get the chance to visit the community of Nuevo Horizonte, I give the email address there, and I know none of you are going to copy this down, but you can Google it. So please visit them, because they are open to tourists from all over the world. Like I mentioned, they have projects. And if you ever go visit them, you'll be struck by not only their tenacity, but also the fact that their community is not perfect. Because in their struggle for peace, in their journey to positive peace, you can imagine it's filled with disappointment, with conflict, with all kinds of strife, with major struggle. But I think that's the tenet of what we all struggle with when you're trying to achieve peace. Building a culture of peace is a human endeavor. It's not perfect, but we are doing our best. So in closing, I just want to say to you that this is their story. And I really appreciate, because often when people go to other places in other countries and you ask people, what do you want me to do for you? And so often I've found people say, go back and tell our story. And so this is what they want me to do. So I thank you very much for sharing their story with me. And think about what people can achieve when we remain united. Thanks.